South African school children have missed at least 3/4 of school in the past 2 calendar years because of the coronavirus pandemic. This has had a considerable impact on how much they could learn. And now a new study by Stellenbosch University's research on a socio-economic policy team has revealed that due to the country's vastly different socio-economic circumstances, those from disadvantaged homes are affected the worst. For this and more findings, let's speak to Professor of Economics and one of the authors of the study, Professor Servaas van der Berg, who joins us virtually from Stellenbosch. Prof, thank you so much for your time this evening. Now, around about the time that the announcement came that schools were going to be opening up again for face-to-face learning, we had a series of conversations of people, experts, mainly on the education front, warning about the huge amount of catch-up that's going to be needed as a result of those lost months. It feels like years, really, and how it would affect different phases and grades of the school and what the knock-on effect has been. But you and I both know data and research is king, and this research now proves that this is the massive problem and headache that our educators and indeed our economy later on will be sitting on. Explain to us just to start the foundations of this study. It is the largest study of this kind involving 80,000 learners and from various socio-economic backgrounds as well, which really should give us a really good snapshot of the national picture education-wise. Talk to us just about the basis of the study.
Right, thanks. So the study was done on the Western Cape systemic tests. Those tests are usually run every year. In 2020, we did not have it because of COVID. But so those tests are done on scale for virtually all children in grade 3, grade 6, and in grade 9. And as you said, there were about 80,000 students in each of these grades. So these tests were run in various years. What we did is to analyze the data for 2019 compared to 2021. At the end of 2021, learners wrote the same wrote this test. Many of the questions were exactly the same for the purpose of making comparisons. So we focused only on those questions which were the same in both years. And based on that, we could get to a very good understanding of the overall effect of the pandemic-related lockdowns and missing school and rotational timetabling and all of that. And we could do so also across the school quintiles, which is the categorization for schools that is often used to differentiate the poorer schools generally from the richer ones. So in quintile 5, the richest schools, the overall effect has been much smaller, but still large. And I think that's an important thing to recognize. So our findings are that there is approximately a year of school backlog. So the 2021 cohorts were about a year behind, where similar age groups were 2 years earlier. And so on average about a year. It's worse in mathematics than in language. And it is particularly bad when one talks about language in grade 6, because that is where one also tests those children who have changed the language of learning and teaching, the so-called LOT, or the medium of instruction, which changes for the majority of South African learners between the grade 3 and grade 4. So by grade 6, the result of that change has been greater learning losses than in the past, because the children had simply not been attending school. I should just perhaps add one more thing in that regard, Marcel, and that is that the learning losses are not necessarily the same as a number of days lost, because to some extent one can sometimes expect catch-up, so that you can use your time better in the less time you have. On the other hand, we also find forgetting. so that if learners have been out of school for a very long time, as was the case for many of South African learners, or almost all South African learners in this period, then there's also a process of forgetting, which means that they fall even further behind.
If I may just come in there for a second, because obviously these kinds of studies are being done across the world, and South Africa has never really fared well on the international platform when it comes to those tests on mathematics and a focus on reading as well. And now, according to your study, you found that you mentioned those learning losses larger in mathematics than in language. That is mirrored by findings internationally in terms of education losses as a result of the pandemic. But talk to me about where this now leaves us when compared to those international benchmarks, because South Africa has scored pretty low even before the pandemic when it comes to those international benchmarks.
Yes, indeed. So there are a series of international tests that are conducted in a large number of countries. South Africa has participated for a number of years in 4 of these tests. 3 of them are relevant or 2 of them are relevant for this purpose. It's a so-called TIMS test, which tests mathematics and science, and we specifically looked at mathematics. So we found, for instance, that in the low international benchmark, which says which is barely acceptable or even below that internationally, 64% of South African grade 5 learners perform below that. And our estimate is that given the learning losses we've seen here, that number who are performing below the low international benchmark would go up to 76%, so more than 3/4. In reading, and that is fairly well known, the so-called Pearl study has found that about 80% of South African learners cannot read for meaning in a consistent way, and that is now likely to have gone up to around 88%. So a large problem in our education system, which has made some progress in recent years, but unfortunately this progress is to a large extent being undone by the effect of the pandemic.
Professor, where does this leave us now? I see in your synopsis of your research that you say that there are 2 policy areas that require special attention, one of them being that more time is needed for mathematics to overcome this lagging now as a result of the pandemic. But what do you see when looking at your research? Because obviously you look further down the looking glass about what the impact would be on this generation for when they're supposed to matriculate, when they're supposed to enter the workforce, their impact on the economy, and what this is all costing the government. Because I know your unit also did research, I think it was last year, about the high cost that repeat students are having on our fiscus. What then of the impact of this missing year? I'm going to round it off to a year. You say it's just under a year that they've lost. What do you see as being the impact of this lost time on our education system and then on our society and our economy as a whole?
So I think that we are talking of quite severe impacts. To some extent, we can expect, because our education system has been performing better, as I said, in recent years, one can expect that some of the backlogs can be made up in the course of a school career. So if one is talking about very young children, yes, maybe there are severe issues for them too, but there's time to catch up. But if you think, for instance, parts of the testing that we did was in grade 9. And if you're a year behind in mathematics in grade 9 compared to previous groups of children that have gone through grade 9, that means that you've got 3 years in which you've got to cover roughly 4 years of learning. So clearly time is of the essence. And that means we have to use time better in the school. We have to try to create some time for mathematics, particularly. To some extent, the same applies to English for the many children who have that as a first additional language in particular. But time is of the essence, and it's not easy to rearrange timetables in schools. It's not easy to make more periods available and to have more teachers to do the mathematics. So the adjustments there would have to be in perhaps reducing some of the additional tasks that learners do in other subjects and focusing more of it on the mathematics and language, because those are so foundational for other things as well. And then, of course, that has knock-on effects in the quality of the matriculation examination cohort, those children entering matric, and beyond that also in our universities. Our universities are already complaining about the quality of the mathematics teaching, in particular, that they find that there's not enough depth in terms of the mathematics knowledge of many of our learners. I think that is likely to become quite an issue for a few years more. In terms of the wider context and its impact on society, we have just started a new study on the COVID generation. We don't think it's a generational problem. We think that some of it can be dealt with a little more easily. But what is clear is that there are effects that will be with us for quite a few years. And that means we have to see at what happens in terms of the flows through the system. Repetition rates, for instance, went down during the pandemic because schools could not assess in the same way as they did in the past. So we've seen more learners being promoted to higher grades. So we'll have a more diverse group of learners, typically in higher grades than in the past. All of that makes it very difficult for teachers.
Indeed it does. Thank you so much. Time is indeed of the essence. I think we'll take that message from all information you've given us. Stellenbosch University Professor of Economics, Professor Servaas van der Berg. We thank him for his time this evening.